Well, good morning. Welcome to folks here in the room. Welcome to folks on the live stream. We're starting a little bit late today. Thanks for bearing with us, but welcome. So you know where we are. We've been in a series talking about, a short series called The Ties That Bind, where we've been exploring how language regarding family is how it functions in Christian theology in helpful ways sometimes in less than helpful ways. Like all theological language, it's inexact and imprecise, and it changes depending upon the culture and the times. And a lot of us have been shaped in various ways that we don't always think about, kind of regarding how we talk about God, how we talk about church, how we talk about our relationships with each other. So after a week off last week for the joint session with the Social Justice Forum around Earth Day, we're now back to talking about ties that bind. And today we're doing something a little bit different in that there's two of us up here. You might not know Tim Delmont. Tim's been a member of Westminster for
20 years?
20 years. So if you don't know him, it's time. Today is your day. And we could say a lot about Tim. I'm just try to keep it brief. I'll point out that he is, one of the reasons that he's up here is he's the author of a book, a parenting memoir. Is that a fair description of it? Called Everyday Dad, a memoir about single parenting. That chronicles or tells the story of his first 10 years as a single parent. And that's not unheard of, but somewhat unusual. And I think the notion of single parenting all of a sudden creates this I don't know, I don't want to cheapen it and call it like a laboratory, but get a chance to think about parenting roles, values, priorities in parenting, and how you think about how the culture tells you what parenting looks like, maybe how your theology or how your faith community tells you about parenting, and offers support or doesn't. So it's a chance to dive in more deeply to questions around fatherhood. At the same time, this, I think, has application to parenthood in general, or even grandparenthood, or even godparenthood, or special aunt, special uncle to neighbors. How we think about raising children as a vocation that people have, and how that is something that's deeply held individually, but also communal. And so the way I described this was, Christian faith has a complicated history when it comes to imagining what good parenting looks like. And so much of that is tied up in understandings of gender roles that are sometimes held in faith communities, sometimes held more broadly in the culture. In the case of fathers, it's often tied up deeply into how we understand what masculinity is, right? What a good man is supposed to be or to do. How do we speak about fatherhood as a calling? What does that mean for people who don't become fathers? How are they also pursuing callings, and how does that matter for sustaining community? And how does our theology help us or hinder us when we think about these topics? So we're going to do kind of an interview, a back and forth format today, but we wanted to start off with a question for you to consider at your tables, which is up here on the board. What kind of talk do we hear in churches about fatherhood? That is, what it is, why it's important, or how it is done best. And the question is deliberately vague about what do we hear in churches. We're not necessarily talking about Westminster in particular, but, from the Christian world, so to speak, what kind of language do we hear? We could have framed this about culture, right? Like, what do sitcoms or movies tell us about parenting? But instead, what's some of the talk that you've heard in theological circles, as we would say, or church circles, either ones that you've participated in or kind of what you see in media. So why don't we just give maybe just 5 minutes to talk around your tables? This can be really simple, kind of a popcorn exercise of just like, some people say you have to have this kind of a family structure to be a truly godly family, right? Or some people talk about fatherhood in other kinds of ways. So this, even language about God as Father, of course, is maybe one of the easy points here. Tim talked about that in his sermon, the other Tim, not this Tim, during his sermon series in Lent when we talked about the Lord's Prayer. So does the question make sense? All right. Are you all excited to talk about the question at your tables? You can be as positive or negative as the Spirit leads you this morning. There are no wrong answers. All right.
Good question. Okay. Hi, everyone. Let's get to
So we're gonna collect some answers from the tables. I'll run around with the microphone and just kind of short answers, like either themes or topics, refrains that you might have heard, the things you talked about at your table. And people online, you might want to put things in the chat. So, anyway, anybody want to share something you heard at your table? You're being called out. Any willing volunteers? Okay, we'll warm up the crowd.
Yeah, I think among us, we kind of came up with a theme of the conversation has been more implicit than explicit.
Yeah, that's my experience too. Implicit more than explicit. It's important people volunteer. This is how I get my exercise on Sundays.
We just were talking a little bit about the Bible and the Old Testament and how many fathers in the Old Testament seem to exert powerful and you know, the son of so-and-so, and even offering up your son to death, so power.
Yeah, the sacrifice of Isaac, we could spend a whole month on the near sacrifice of Isaac. Yeah, some of those fathers look less like heads of households than they look like what we would call a warlord today or something, right? Who seem to have these traveling communities of people who are trying to stay alive. Others.
We talked some about experiences with people from more conservative churches feeling very patriarchal in their view of fatherhood, and then, but feeling like the conversation that's non-patriarchal tends to be more parenthood and not father-specific, and wondering kind of what a father-specific view that's non-patriarchal looks like.
Yeah, is it possible to have a fatherhood notion that avoids patriarchy in some way? Anybody seen that?
Yeah, my son and his husband and their 6-year-old son. So I missed the beginnings, but my first question to you is, will you be discussing motherhood as well? And then, we talked about the patriarchy, that the Bible was written during a patriarchal time. It has continued to the present, and the patriarchy has not been good to women. It is affirmative action for men, and it doesn't give itself up. And so it's been a difficult piece for a lot of us just to focus on fatherhood.
Yes, thanks for that. Maybe I'll just switch to announcements really quick. We are talking about Christian motherhood, or mothering in the Christian tradition is the exact title of that, on the 21st of May, I believe. Amy Marga is coming back. Some of you remember her. She teaches at Luther Seminary with me, teaches theology there. She taught, I think it was in October, and talked a bit about, when talking about the death of Jesus, talked a bit about mothering there. She's got a recent book out on kind of how the church has treated mothering, and in some ways consigned women's roles exclusively to mothering or to reproduction. So that'll be on the 21st. And on the 14th, also Jimmy Hoke's going to be here, who teaches at Luther College, talking about queer contributions to an understanding of Christian community and family as well. So we've already kind of noticed ways in which we're speaking about gender roles, and some of those gender roles are less absolute than sometimes the Bible reflects, or sometimes our theology reflects. So Jimmy will help us with some of that. Sure. Next week, since we're doing announcements, Margaret will be talking about friendship and community. If I remember the title exactly, how do we pull this away from just talking about marriage or reproduction, romantic relationships, and talk about community more generally. So we will be having a class next week, even though there's going to be an information session at the same time. So join us for that. Margaret apologizes for not being here. She is in either Georgia or Alabama today. They're finishing up their civil rights trip, so in case you're wondering where she is. Anyway, announcements are now over. That'll save us time at the end. Anything else that a group wants to report back? All right. It's another complicated topic, and we're going to try to solve it in the next half hour. So, or at least open up some new vistas on it, right?
That's it.
So I introduced Tim earlier. If you came in late, Tim Delmont, member of our church, also the father of a memoir called Everyday Dad. It has a subtitle, a memoir about single parenting, and we left a copy of an article he recently wrote on the table. So you want to say anything about the article as we kick off, Tim?
It was easy to write. There were so many things I had no clue about. And the book is about the first 10 years that I was a single parent, and these questions that I have for you are questions that just came up. I don't know that I found the answers, but when I've talked to other friends, usually they've had to deal with some of the same questions. So if you have a chance to pick it up and read it, I hope you find something of use or value in it.
Excellent.
Yep.
Why don't we start? I'm going to kind of open up a conversation with Tim, and then we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. But can you tell us briefly about your story, the circumstances of your life, and maybe a couple discoveries you made along your way as a single parent?
Yes. Thank you for inviting me this morning, and good morning, everyone. Another dreary day outside, but we think this session is going to be interesting, and we hope you find it worthwhile. I think through my life, I've had a definition floating in my mind about what is a traditional family. What is the nuclear family? The term is often interchangeable. And I've always thought, and maybe you have too, that there is a man who marries a woman, and together they have at least one child, okay? Maybe two. And I was thinking, in preparing for my remarks this morning, that in my 7 decades on this earth, I have lived in a nuclear family 10% of the time, maybe 7 years if I'm lucky. Everything else has been engaged in some kind of other family structure. So the short story is that my mom and dad separated when I was a year old, and then subsequently divorced. So I grew up with a strong woman, a strong mother, and she was a single parent the rest of her life, for that matter. When I married, my wife and I had one child together, and then 5 years later, we had a son the first time, she gave birth to our daughter, and we were just delighted. We had a little girl. And then my wife had a heart attack, and she died. And she was 33, seemingly in good health. We had our lives ahead of us, the foursome, the household. It was horrible. It was just shocking. I was a single dad with a 10-week-old baby and a 5-year-old son. So that went on for about 7 years. I met someone else. I did remarry, and my second wife had a son from her first marriage. So I was introduced to being a stepfather, for which I was not any better prepared than I had been when I became a biological father. We were together for about a year. The marriage did not work. We separated, subsequently divorced, and I had a 15-year run as a single parent for my children who were then growing into adolescence and adulthood. Things changed for the better. I have to do this, sorry, Joe. I met Joe Beld, who many of you know, who's active here in the church, and Joe and I married. And guess what? Joe had 2 boys from her first marriage, so I went back to, and I was delighted to be a stepfather again, and I'm also even more delighted to be able to tell you that next year, Joe and I will celebrate our 25th anniversary. And one way or another, our four children have somehow survived both me and the parenting that we've provided for them. So my message to you is, it's been challenging. It's been challenging, and it has been joyful to take on roles for which I was not necessarily prepared, but that I needed to figure out how to do. And particularly, and this speaks, I think, to Betty's issue, particularly learn what is it I can do with my partner, in my case, my wives, that allows us to share the family roles in ways that make sense, that speak to our skills, but in general meet the overall roles of the family. So there's two discoveries, if I may, Matt. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One is, and it came early in when I was first a single parent. I talk about it in the book. One of my friends and I were having coffee, and maybe it was 3 or 4 years into it, and he leaned across and he said, Tim, you're a parent for life. And, I knew that, but it didn't hit me as a cliche. It was not a cliche. It was reality. It was reality. And one of the things that I think I've discovered is that our children need us through their lives. There's heavy lifting for we parents, babyhood to 10 years of age, babyhood to 18 when most kids leave, but it doesn't end there because their lives change, don't they? Think about it. What have you done, those of you who are parents, in your own adulthood with your adult kids? I bet there are things that you'll never forget where there was intervention because they said they needed you or you sensed that it was valuable for you to engage. So that parenting for life was a discovery I had no clue about when I first became a parent, and I value that so much. The second discovery, I would say, and it's with a certain amount of hubris that I bring this to you, but we men, we dads, can learn how to carry out almost any family role with competence. we can do it. We can do it. If we have opportunities and you take advantage of those opportunities, guess what? You can find your way to lunch to buy the groceries. You can make meals that people eat and say, oh, that was pretty good, Dad. You don't have to shrink your children's clothing when you wash them. You can talk, you can talk to your 13-year-old whose acne is terrible and doesn't want to go to school. I mean, these are things that human beings learn, that moms learn, and that dads can learn if they want to. And the corollary to that second discovery, that men can do it, we men can do it, we dads can do it, is how satisfying it is. It feels great to actually get better at things. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I know a lot of moms who I think carry that sense that I can't make a mistake. I made mistakes, so that wasn't something that I had to deal with. But it's that notion that if you're fully engaged with your children and you share a lot of those roles with your partner, with your wife in my case, it enhances purpose. It brings more meaning to life. It's not only about, did I do well in my work? Because we know we want to do well, men and women both. You're trained to do it, you want to show up, you want to do a terrific job. Your colleagues deserve it, your company, whatever it is, your school. But that's only part of what there is in life, from what I've discovered. So I'm grateful again for what the opportunities I've had and some of the discoveries I've made.
Yeah. I think you've talked about some of the ways in which some of these challenges are mapped onto gender, right? That our culture tells us men are good at certain things, women are good at certain things, and somehow we believe that, or it sticks, or gets woven into how we think about ourselves and how we parent. What about when it comes to single parenting? I mean, what are some of the discoveries you made about that in terms of what was challenging about it, but particular roles you had to fulfill as being the only adult in the household that you weren't ready for,
yes,
or that made you get ready for them in a hurry?
Yes. Some things stand out. The first is it's just so hard. There's so much to do. It's 24/7. I can't tell you how many times I wish I could hand off something, or I had somebody to talk to. You make decisions for the well-being of your kids, and you wish there was someone else you could say, is this what we should do? Is this where we should go? Is this going to work for our kids? But there's not time. There's just not time. All that stuff I talked about, the washing and the running and the going and connecting, that's what it's like. There just almost isn't time to think. And some of my better friends when I was a single parent were women who were single parents, because we would meet each other. I was the outlier, at the soccer game or the PTA meeting because I was a man. But we shared the same aspirations. We had the same goals for our kids. And they modeled, they told me what they were doing. Single women who were parents were models for me. I'm so grateful. I learned from them. I learned from my mother, for that matter, too, because you have to learn from somebody. What I would say, though, is in addition to just the endlessness of it, you just got to get up and get going, show up, show up, show up. A second thing that I needed to work on in particular, and I don't know that it's gender-related at all, but I had to find a way to be sensitive to, on a regular basis, the emotional needs of my children. I had to pick up the signs, the signals. what were we talking about? How were we communicating? What was their body language? What was the feeling under their words? What was their expressions? What was their moods? I mean, I came out of kind of an analytical experience. I was hired as a budget analyst at the University of Minnesota, and my job was with a team was to prepare budget requests to the governor's office and the state legislature, money committees. That's about data. That's about findings. That's about persuasive arguments, and you bore right in. You don't care a whole lot. I mean, you really don't. When you're trading off about how much money goes into an appropriations bill, it's not so much about feeling. It's about how does this work, okay? And then later on, when I was pursuing a PhD and writing a dissertation, which was 3 years, that was heavily data-driven. So my mind was working that way, and I needed to listen. I needed to learn how to listen to what my children were saying and not saying for their benefit, not so much for me, but for their benefit. Because I was the only person for most of the time with whom they connected when they were at home, even though we had nanas. And it started early. My realization started very early that was needed. I'll tell you a quick story. It was at about 3 in the morning, and my kids were sleeping, and maybe 3 a.m. I still remember this vividly. And I heard my daughter. I heard her bedroom was next to mine, 3 feet away, and it sounded like she was crying. So I got up and I walked in, and she was 2.5 years old, 2.5, 3 years old, and she was standing straight up. She was in her little white nightgown, and blankets were strewn. And as I walked closer to her, I saw her. She was crying. And I heard her say, "Why did my mommy have to die?" So I went up and I hugged her, and her little body was against my chest. I could hear her sobbing. And then I just laid her down slowly. She was asleep. She was asleep the whole time. And I sat on the edge of the bed and I just held her hand for a couple hours. I thought, how could this be? Well, the next morning, she didn't remember. I mean, she didn't remember what she had said or that she had awakened. But it occurred to me for the first time, 2.5-year-old, the currents ran deep in her. The currents ran deep. So part of the listening, part of the communication in our case was also dealing with the grief and loss. And my son, my boy, was 5 when his mom died, and he pulled inward. He pulled inward some, and he wasn't as expressive. He was a fun kid, but his teacher said that, and his grandparents saw him. He was dealing with it in his way. He was still active, and he had me as kind of a slender reed. He'd be the same to me that he'd always been. But he needed about 1.5 years before he could come back to kind of the kid that he was. He was dealing with that issue. So I would say that's a very important thing, becoming your own best emotional self. We adults need to do that for our children. And then quickly, Matt, one last thing. The third issue I think that single parents, whether they're male or female, deal with is the endless question of work-life balance. How do we get it right? How do we make sure that our children are taken care of? And we still do a really good day's work because the timing isn't there. And I had 3 live-in nannies the first year. They all went for better jobs afterwards, but that meant there were holes that full first year and scheduling and all the rest of it. And what I found is we had to do a couple things. Like I was in a civil service position in the beginning of my career, and we had a 15-minute break in the morning and 15 minutes in the afternoon and a half hour for lunch. And I was finding by about 3 o'clock, I was just starting to drift, getting up at night, and even after my daughter stopped feedings at night, I was just tired. So I went to my boss and I said, could I combine my 2 breaks, morning and afternoon, I got a half hour, and chip off 10 minutes from my lunch? He said, yeah, 40 minutes. Well, at Kaufman Union, they had a special room with 6 beds. It was called the Quiet Room. It was in the faculty library. Get it? Faculty library, the retirees would go in. That may be
Yeah,
at
sounds
some
great.
point. I don't know if Luther's got it, but so off I went at 3 o'clock, and I slept. Oh, that was so good. I got a half hour in. 40 minutes, and I run back to the office. And then I perked up. I had the rest of the afternoon, and I could get through the evening. But it was things like that. Or later on, I asked my boss if I could go on a 4-day work week. That was unheard of 40 years ago. But he agreed. He agreed. And then again, 3-day weekend. Whoa, 3-day weekend. We can get this done. So those are the big three, I would say, about single parenting.
No, I'm struck about how some of this really focalizes the challenge that is part of parenting in general or childcare in general, and how some of this obviously maps onto not just gender, but class and status and other opportunities and things like that. So you're raising a lot of key questions here that are mapped onto you, obviously, in your own life. So thanks for your vulnerability with this, in sharing all of this. Are there ways that your faith in God helped motivate you or equip you to be a father to your children or a parent to your children?
This is a tough question for me. But when I thought about it, I thought of Jesus' commandments. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. The tough part is that I think I really have been on a journey that many of you have also probably been on, kind of trying to understand who is God and what's the connection in a real way, and studying our theologies and considering the mysteries of it. I'm still on that journey. I need to continue. Fortunately, there are good friends here who are better scholars than I am, and I learned from them in the Adult Education Council, for example. But the second commandment, your neighbor, look to your neighbor. I think that one I've had a tape, running all the way through, because I grew up Catholic, and Catholic social thought was very real in the 60s and 70s. And then I moved, and I went to Catholic schools all the way through college. And then I moved to Unitarian Universalism, which my first wife practiced. And so did my second. We were married, my second wife and I were married by a Unitarian Universalist minister. And as many of you know, there's can be a kind of integrated Christianity humanism that's at work, but it has a lot to do with outreach to the community. And then as time went on, eventually when Joe and I married an Episcopalian church, liberal Protestant mainstream in our case, and came here, one of the things that brought us here was the outreach program. So I think that thread of social justice and mercy and reaching out to those who have need, that's been overall kind of a strong philosophy for me. And to give you a couple examples, I'm taking care of little children as part of that. But when my daughter was in high school, at Washburn High School in southwest Minneapolis, the school was about 55% kids of color, maybe 45% white kids. And the kids of color came from all over. And I was PTA president, and the first meeting, we had about 50 parents. I thought, this is good. They told me this was good. 50 parents showed up. 48 were white, 2 were black. And we just realized we cannot make policy. You cannot deal with the politics and culture of a school with those kind of numbers. So my vice president and I went to the black parents that we knew and others that she found, and we asked, what could we do? And we got a proposal from the black community to create a second parents group, parents of students of color. So we did. So we ran 2 tracks, and there would be interaction between the two. Both groups came up, and the parents of color needed to have a feeling of identity and trust. They said that. They were in this all-white island, and they needed to be together and think things out together. And one of the things that came out, one of the recommendations was whether our teaching staff at Washburn could get some education about how to deal with kids who are from different cultures, okay? And so we agreed. I got some money we took PTA money and money from the principal, who was black. And to their credit, our teaching staff, the whole staff went to the Humphrey Institute the next summer before we started the academic year. And they spent a day or two in seminars and workshops discussing racial issues. And it made a difference, okay? To me, that was practical, specific, actionable social justice. Or another thing was that I experienced as a single parent in particular was elder care. So my mother-in-law, for example, was ill in the latter years of her life, and one year she needed to go to ER 3 times. And her daughter was dead, her husband was dead, her 2 sisters were dead, her friends were dead, she had a son-in-law. So one time we sat there waiting for the doctor to come in or whoever would take care of us, and she said, well, I did it again. And I looked at her and I said, yeah, and you're stuck with me. We both laughed. The grandparent, Grandpa Bob, was my first wife's biological dad, and he lived in Los Angeles, and we were in close contact with him all the way through the years. But then he wasn't answering phone calls, and he wasn't answering mail, and we wondered. So my son and I flew out to L.A., and we got access to his apartment. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday, and we saw Bob. He was in his robe, his night robe, and the place was a mess. It was disheveled. At one point, I looked into his mail, into his container, wastebasket, and I found a check for $17,000. It was in an envelope. It was his share of property that had been sold by his siblings in Maine. He had never opened it. He'd thrown it out. So we stayed for a week to try to find, where can we find a place for Grandpa Bob that would be right for him? And then I went back a second week, and we did find a place, and we were able to move him. But to me, that elder care, is it right out of the gospel? It's right out of the gospel, or the Beatitudes. Blessed are the merciful. I did not feel, like I was blessed, but I felt the reality of that teaching, that it was very important, and that the kids were involved, one way or the other, both at Washburn and then going out to L.A., because I was trying to model some behavior that I thought was consistent with the Christian gospel. So.
One of the risks of doing a session like this is you don't want to put somebody on stage who makes everybody else feel bad about their own shortcomings, and so I'm just realizing what a horrible person I am the more you talk. So, yeah. No, thank you. That was a shot at me, not at you. I want to combine two questions that we talked about before, and this is about, like Jan said earlier, about how I think it was. It's more implicit than explicit, the way we are kind of fed messages about fatherhood and parenting. Is that right? Am I remembering correctly? So much of this comes from culture, and there are stereotypes about parenting, about fatherhood in particular. There's taboos about it. We get these tropes from TV shows about the clueless father, right, who's the last to understand anything, which is different. At one time, the father was always the source of wisdom in a lot of older TV shows. I mean, they're not all the same, and the exceptions maybe prove the rule. But one of the stereotypes is, and this is, I think, true for whoever the partners are, whoever the parents are, that there's a kind of feminine wisdom that needs to be part of every household that men just don't get. In some cases, too, I see the idea of a single father being kind of a pathetic figure, like he's less masculine than his buddies who are out, drinking beer and going to the game on a weekend or something because he has other things to do. Were there some of those like stereotypes that either surprised you or that frustrated you or that you had to overcome, whether they come from the church, whether they come from the culture, your neighborhood? Does that make sense how I combine the questions?
Yeah, it's really a good question.
Because I think we all deal with them in our own ways of negotiating the world, whether we're parents or not.
Yeah, I was fortunate. I had loving family around me, the grandparents, neighbors who were also raising children at the same time that I was. They were there. I asked for help. And you have to do that. We formed a team eventually. The first year was chaos, just chaotic, with 3 live-ins coming and going. But by the second year, my daughter's second year, just 2, I was able to find a nanny who could come in 4 days a week during the work day. And my mom had retired, and she was healthy. She was in her 60s. I went to St. Paul and brought her over on the 5th day. So we had a team. I was in the team, but we had a team to take care of our children, and we respected each other for the roles that were there. So the honest answer to your question is, I would ask myself, well, why wouldn't I do these things? Why wouldn't I clothe my children? Why wouldn't I get them to the doctor, or the nanny would get them to the doctor? Why wouldn't I put them in the presence of their loving grandparents? What's that got to do with being a man, clueless or otherwise? These are just the tasks of the moment that children need. You do it. I will say that the cluelessness that I saw on TV was sort of stung a little. I would turn the program off because it had nothing to do with my reality, But I also say that, and And I know this is true of the moms, the single moms with whom I became friends, social friends. There is an inner critic at work. You know, you do think, oh, how did I make that mistake? You know, how could I have possibly done that again? What's wrong with me? You know, I need to do better. I need to do better. And you don't escape that. I didn't escape that. But that's different than that kind of mocking cluelessness of the, you know, he doesn't know what to do about anything. Or even Kramer versus Kramer. Remember the movie? There's one scene in which Dustin Hoffman's trying to make a breakfast, eggs or something, and he blows the whole thing up. He can't make an egg. And this is Kramer versus Kramer, which was supposed to be a positive, you know, description of parenting, both male and female. So, and also I should tell you too, there's a certain kind of, it doesn't fit the stereotype, but honestly, as a single parent, there's a certain kind of mindlessness that occurs. Perhaps you've experienced it, those of you who have been parents with partners. One time, for example, our nanny, whose name was Eldora, called me at my office at the U and said, you know, Tim, Anne's home sick. Could you get her some ice cream? I said, okay, I'll do that. So I stopped at the store, got some ice cream for her, and I also had to get my shoes. I had resold, had a pair of loafers that were resold on the way home. So I got home, and I went up and I talked to Anne. I said, hey, I got you the ice cream, and, you know, I'm making supper, and you can have it afterwards. And she said, okay, Daddy. So I got downstairs, and I was making the meal, and something didn't feel right. And I couldn't quite figure out what it was. I don't know. It was just, I didn't know what it was. And I went to the refrigerator to get something to make, and I opened the freezer on the top, okay? And sitting next to the two blue trays of ice cream was a nicely polished, brown, size 11 pair of men's loafers. I put the shoes in. Ding, ding, ding. So then I went upstairs, figuring there's something else here, and I opened my closet door, and I looked in, and there was a yellowish bag, you know, and with something in it, and somehow it had sprung a hole, and some vanilla ice cream, a triple of a ripple, was moving towards my bedroom slippers. And that wasn't unusual. Things like that could happen. But again, it's not cluelessness. It's just the way of the world. Yeah. Okay?
It's about time to go to conversation with everybody else.
Okay.
Do you want to say anything about vocation, or will that come out in the conversation to come?
Just that, to me, as time went on, I thought that being a father, being a parent, whether single or as a stepfather, was more than a calling. It's more than a calling. Earlier in my life, I had thought of calling in the typical ways. Work as a vocation, or religiously people have. But over time, as I began to feel the importance, the meaningfulness, the purposefulness of parenting, it fit into a wider picture. What is the wholeness of life? Why are we here? What are we doing? Shouldn't parenting be part of this larger picture? And in recent times, and this is a plug for sorry, Joe, this is a plug for St. Olaf, but she and many other leaders have created the Lutheran Center for Faith, Values, and Community at St. Olaf. And what the center is doing is promoting with students and outside groups, churches, some ideas, I think, about the fullness of life that I'm talking with you about now. And their motto is, get this right, live your life in purpose for the common good. Live your life in purpose for the common good. So I put parenting into that wholeness, that notion of how well can we live our lives? Take it on. And so I think it's beyond a calling.
Yeah. Before we get into conversation and we run out of time and people have to leave, I want to thank you.
Sure.
There's a lot of vulnerability from you, which I deeply appreciate. And it ties into kind of what we've been doing all year and talking about theology, which raises questions about how we've been raised and how we've been formed and malformed by churches and by communities. And just thanks for opening up your life to us. I just want to make sure we thank Tim before we go too much farther.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Glad to do it. Thank you.
Yeah, there's something about talking about this. I think about where are the venues, where are the places where somebody feels comfortable to ask for help whether it's in parenting, whether it's in a marriage, whether it's in being a child to aging parents or whatever, or just, and how can church be one of those places, but what is it that sometimes makes churches hard places for that to happen because of the expectations, right, or because of the nature of a community. And I think conversation is a great way to do that. So I'm hoping this conversation has opened up some conversations in people's own minds or on the way home or in the weeks to come. We don't have like closing brilliant remarks that make everything all right. What we hoped to do was to raise some questions about how do we think about parenting, and today in particular fatherhood, which is in some ways like motherhood, in some ways not. How do we think about this, particularly in a church community, right, where we have language about God, language about families, language about norms? If you remember 2 weeks ago, we talked about, the topic was how did the church become a family, and the ways in which churches kind of took on family structures for their own ways of organizing themselves, with all of the patriarchy inherent in that we see back in biblical writings, right, where there was typically a man who ran the community, or a god who ran the community, and everybody kind of knew their place in that social pyramid. That's not a model of church that I hear talked about a lot explicitly, and it certainly isn't one that Westminster aspires to. But Margaret also 2 weeks ago talked about home as a different model, kind of an alternate model to a family. So when we think of family, we often think of structure, and we think of layers of either generations or of responsibility or authority or whatever. And home sometimes is a much more fluid concept, and I heard that a bit in some of the things that you talked about. So that might be one thing that we discuss, or that we think about, is how do our ways of thinking about parenthood, again, not everybody is a parent, not everybody can become a parent, not everybody chooses to become a parent. It's a loaded topic in a number of ways, but all of us have parents, whether we know them or not, and this functions a lot in how we think about who we are in the world. So as a way of maybe bringing this to conclusion, are there things that we've either recognized today, kind of either reaffirmed or taught you something new, or what are the questions still yet to be discussed that maybe were touched on or maybe totally ignored that kind of matter for a conversation like this in a faith community, which we are?
So in the category of so many questions, right, my thought was, how did you have time for your own grief? In which you could broaden to say, as a parent, how do you make time for yourself? But in your case, I mean, specifically, after you lost your wife at 33.
I think I repressed my feelings at times, just to get through, And I found that I believe that's the case because when I wrote the book, which started 5 years ago, I found myself in tears at times, 2 a.m, and I realized I'd been a pretty effective little repressor. I hadn't come to terms with all of my feelings, probably, and I think that that's not unusual necessarily. So try to do better on that. That's part of the other side of attentiveness to your children's emotional needs. We have to pay attention to ourselves, and I think we're pretty good at maybe ignoring that need at times. We're here in the state. It's a beautiful state. We have a cabin in northern Minnesota. I can't tell you how many times I sat on the dock looking out across the lake at the sun going down, red gold, Or here in Minneapolis, we have, and in the metropolitan area, so much beautiful land. And at times, when I had a chance, and we're just a half a block from Joe and I from Lake Harriet, and I was living in the same house all those years, still have. Just go to the lake, time alone, time to feel, time to remember. Once I had dropped my children off at their grandparents', and they used to take them Saturday nights and then Sunday mornings when I was trying to write a dissertation. That's basically a research book. And all my stuff, all my notes were at my university office. So I usually went then, dropped the kids off, and then I'd go to my office and go back Sunday morning and work. Didn't go to church then. And but once I delayed, and I just bivouacked over, and I went down Mississippi River Boulevard on the east side I went to the apartment where my wife had lived in. And I walked up. There wasn't security. I went up to the second floor. And I went to her apartment door. And I just stood there for a while. And I remembered, laughter, conversations, dinners, our planning for our marriage. And then I went back out. And it was like April then. It was cold and windy. But I went to a place that I hadn't been to for a while. I mean, it was a physical place, but it was an emotional place too, just to feel, and I missed her. I missed my wife. So that's made me that much more grateful for my long current marriage. Yeah.
Tim, thank you very much for your presentation today.
Welcome.
My observation is that your situation was brought about by a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I also can recall in one of the ministry services that I've done here with employment transition,
Yeah.
a story that was shared by a young father who had just been fired, lost their job,
Mm-hmm.
and how it opened up the world of being a better father to that individual by spending time at school with the kids, volunteering, and so forth.
Yeah.
So my observation is, why does it take a crisis for us as fathers sometimes to realize that there's this whole world of doing a better job at being a father?
The last thing I'm here to do is criticize any man, any father. There are pressures, there are stresses, to keep the more traditional model afloat. And the dads that I've talked with who live that way, will say, God, I wish I had more time for my children, or my wife's been really a great parent of our kids. And they don't know how to get out of it. They're not quite sure, and there's no modeling for them in their immediate life circumstance. And the notion of being a good provider, sort of leading the family in certain ways is powerful. It's a powerful image in society. So as you just heard Matt say, I think part of what might make a difference is conversations. So, and that's what I'm hoping to do, to go to different schools and churches and you name it, and just bring up these questions and talk. Because when I talk with men, generally, they start to think about things that they haven't seen in quite the same way before. And I think, it's not just trauma, it's these other issues that are at play that can help us, other opportunities that are at play that can help men expand their reality. There is something, though, I don't know when it exactly happened, maybe it was my first year as a single parent, where I hadn't quite got it, that I couldn't do everything. We couldn't continue things as they were. Couldn't continue, the plans to get a doctorate and move up in the world and all that. I knew my wife was dead. I knew I was a single parent. I'd been doing it for a year. But there's something about a lack of comprehension. And then it just hit me. I just realized it one day. And I think it came from someone told me again, and I heard this phrase before, it's not about you. It's about them. It's not about you. It's about them. And it sunk in. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to write the dissertation. I may not get promoted. I'm going to be a college president or VP. That's okay. We're on the run. Yeah. So there's also that self-awareness that grows, and I'm not entirely sure how that comes in, but I know it happens for men too.
I think we have to say goodbye to the live stream in just a moment, and then we have time, I think, for one more question or comment. Just a hypothetical question, Tim. If somebody was looking for the memoir, where would they be able to find it?
Oh,
the one called
thank you.
Everyday
He
Dad
wasn't
by
prompted.
Tim
There was none.
Delmont.
We didn't talk about this
No, we
before the
didn't.
session, but the paperback and an e-copy and an audiobook are all available on Amazon. You can get any of the three that you prefer, but you can also get it at any local bookstore, any college bookstore. They'll order any of those if you're interested, and I hope you might consider it. Thank you, Glenn.
Yeah, you're welcome. One more comment or question? Yeah, please.
So I've read the book, And I
Yeah.
really have discussed it with my husband. He hasn't read it. But I've really enjoyed how, in some ways, it reads like a romance novel and a funny book, but it also deals with, you know, real hard choices you made, and yet how you didn't wallow in self-pity as you were making those. You were focused on, this is what we can do now. And that includes launching into the second half, where you've got 4 wonderful children and a beautiful marriage and partnership. And when I reflect on it, I am very aware of other people that I know who have chosen to be sad and focus so on that they never are able to see the gratitude and the learnings as a blessing. And I think that's one thing that really comes through with your experience and the choices you made. So thank you.
Thanks. And I will say too that you know, I'm a person of white privilege. Nice neighborhood. I had a decent job with fringe benefits that made a difference, and so I got help. And not everybody gets help. And